My name is Lily Morgan. I'm 30 years old and I've been using a wheelchair since a spinal injury 2 years ago. I always assumed that if the truth ever caught up to my family, it would happen quietly behind closed doors, not in front of a crowd dressed for celebration, not under a white tent at my brother's wedding. The photographer was adjusting his lens, telling everyone to hold still when I felt someone step too close behind my chair. The champagne tower stood just a few feet away, stacked high, expensive enough that everyone kept glancing at it instead of at me. A voice dropped hard over my shoulder, irritated, sharp, cutting straight through the polite silence. "Stand up already. Stop pretending for attention." I said I couldn't. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't argue, just stated the fact like I always did. I told him I didn't have the balance. That was when he laughed, not amused, but fed up, as if I'd ruined something precious simply by existing. He said I wasn't going to ruin his wedding, not today, not in front of his guests. Before I could react, his hands grabbed me, pulling forward with enough force that my body tipped instantly, my legs useless. My hands reaching for support that wasn't there. The wheelchair stayed behind as I crashed into the champagne tower glass, shattering in every direction, bottles falling, liquid soaking through my clothes as someone screamed about the wedding being destroyed. I lay on the ground, stunned, blood mixing with champagne, afraid to move my head even an inch. Through the noise, someone pushed past the guests and dropped to their knees beside me, telling everyone not to touch me, holding my neck steady with hands that didn't hesitate. Somewhere nearby, a phone was already pressed to someone's ear, emergency services answering before the shouting even stopped. Lying there on the ground, staring straight up, unable to turn away, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself before. What happened that day didn't begin at a wedding. And it was never just about pretending. The morning of the wedding unfolded in a way that felt practiced, as if everyone already knew the expectations, and I was the only one catching up. I got ready by myself, transferring into my chair, carefully checking my bag, adjusting my clothes, making sure there would be no reason for anyone to say I had caused a delay. Independence had become a habit, not out of pride, but necessity, because help in my family always came with conditions. When my parents arrived, there was no greeting, no question about how I was feeling, only a quick scan to confirm I was dressed appropriately and ready on time. In the car, the conversation stayed polite until it didn't. My mother mentioned how stressful weddings were, how emotions ran high, and how important it was for the day to go smoothly. My father followed with a reminder delivered like advice, but meant as instruction, telling me it would be best if I stayed quiet and flexible, that today wasn't the time for complications. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because any response would have turned into an argument framed as concern. By the time we reached the country club, the message was clear. My presence was acceptable. My needs were not. Outside the entrance, guests streamed past effortlessly while we waited for someone to acknowledge that the ramp wasn't positioned correctly. A staff member eventually pointed us toward a side entrance, explaining they were short-handed and would deal with it later. My mother sighed, not at the inconvenience but at the attention it drew, and asked me to just manage it if I could. So I did, navigating around obstacles on my own as my parents walked ahead, pretending the problem had solved itself. Inside smiles came easily to everyone else. People greeted me kindly enough, but quickly, like a required step before moving on. I noticed how conversations lowered when I approached, how eyes flicked to my chair and then away, uncomfortable but unwilling to address it. Heather was the exception. She came over without hesitation, lowered herself to my level instead of standing above me, and asked if I needed anything before the ceremony began. Her tone wasn't patronizing, just careful, as if she understood there were things she didn't know yet. I told her I was fine, because at that point, it felt easier than explaining. Before we could talk further, someone called her name from across the room, and she mouthed an apology before being pulled back into the current of plans and schedules. I watched her disappear, aware that intentions didn't always survive pressure. Tyler moved through the room like everything belonged to him, already, shaking hands, laughing loudly, giving instructions to staff, with the confidence of someone who expected compliance. When he finally noticed me, it wasn't as his sister, but as a variable he hadn't accounted for. He asked my parents questions over my head, discussing timing and placement, making decisions, without including me in them. When I tried to clarify where I should be during the ceremony and photos, he cut me off smoothly, saying they would handle it when the moment came, and that right now wasn't the time to get into details. His voice carried patience on the surface, irritation underneath, like I'd interrupted something important simply by speaking. As the venue filled, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I was directed away from high-traffic areas, positioned at edges, reminded subtly to stay put. No one said I didn't belong there, but no one acted like I did either. Every glance, every deflection, every quiet correction reinforced the same truth. This wedding had been designed to flow around me, not with me, and my role depended on how well I could make myself small without disappearing completely. It didn't begin with the wedding. 2 years earlier, the night that changed everything started with a decision I knew was wrong the moment I agreed to it. Tyler had insisted we go out to celebrate something work-related, nothing formal, just a few drinks near the highway before heading home. I arrived straight from work, tired, planning to stay briefly and leave early. By the time I sat down, his second drink was already in front of him, his voice louder than usual, his movements looser than they should have been. I ordered soda and watched him stack empty glasses like they didn't matter. When I suggested calling a rideshare, he laughed and said I was overreacting. When I offered to drive instead, he brushed it off, teasing me for turning everything into a problem. I had my phone out, the app open, ready to end the discussion, but he reached over, closed it, and told me he was fine. The logic was familiar, the kind that makes caution sound unreasonable, and eventually I gave in, handing the keys back instead of walking away. The first part of the drive was quiet. The road was open, traffic thin, the city lights fading behind us. For a moment, I almost believed I'd imagined the risk. Then his phone vibrated between the seats. He glanced down at the screen. I told him I could read it to him. He waved me off and said it was nothing, one hand on the wheel, the other already typing. The car drifted slightly enough to make my stomach tighten. I told him to look up. He said he had it under control. The phone buzzed again, longer this time, and he stared down just a second too long. Headlights appeared suddenly, too close, the sound of brakes cutting through the night, then a sharp impact that knocked the air from my lungs. The world tilted violently, metal screaming against concrete, glass bursting around us. When everything stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. Smoke filled the car. My chest hurt where the seatbelt pressed into me. I tried to move my legs and felt nothing. I tried again, harder, panic rising, but there was still nothing there. No pain, no response. I told Tyler I couldn't feel my legs. He didn't answer. He stayed frozen, repeating that the other car came out of nowhere, like he needed to hear it said out loud. In the emergency room, time fractured into pieces. Bright lights, hands pulling at my clothes, a collar locked around my neck. A man introduced himself as Dr. Leonard Hayes and spoke calmly about damage to my spine, about surgery that couldn't wait. My parents arrived before I fully understood what he was saying. After the operation, when I woke to unfamiliar weight and emptiness below my waist, Dr. Hayes explained the injury in careful terms, that the spinal cord damage was severe, that walking again was unlikely. My mother cried quietly. My father asked questions about recovery, about timelines, about whether mistakes were made. Tyler lingered near the door, silent. Later, when the room emptied and the curtains were drawn, the conversation shifted. My father talked about police reports and insurance claims. My mother sat close and said this couldn't destroy Tyler's life on top of everything else. They reminded me that confusion was understandable after trauma, that I didn't remember every second clearly, that accidents happened. They said pointing fingers wouldn't change my body, but it could ruin his future. lying there numb below the waist and aching everywhere else. I understood what they wanted without them saying it outright. When the officer asked questions later, I didn't correct the vague answers. I didn't say who had been driving. I let the silence grow around the truth because it was easier than watching my family break further. In that hospital room, I learned how quickly my pain became something negotiable and how easily protecting my brother mattered more than protecting myself. The invitation arrived quietly sealed in thick cardstock. My name printed neatly as if distance and silence had never existed between us. I didn't open it right away. I left it on the counter for hours, knowing exactly what it represented long before I read a single word. When my parents noticed it, my mother smiled with relief, like the envelope itself erased everything that had come before, and my father said this was a chance to move forward, not backward. That same evening, they brought it up again, explaining how important it was for me to attend, how families showed strength by standing together during moments like this, how absences were noticed and rarely forgiven. I said I wasn't sure I could manage a full wedding day physically. That unpredictability wasn't just uncomfortable for me, it could be harmful. My mother said accommodations could be figured out. My father said I worried too much, and neither of them asked what kind of support I actually needed. Tyler called a few days later. His voice was efficient, stripped of emotion, focused entirely on logistics. He told me the venue schedule was tight, that there would be a lot of moving parts, and that it would help if I stayed flexible and followed direction. Then, without changing his tone, he said it might be best if I stayed out of the main photo group just to keep things simple. I asked him what simple meant. He paused briefly and said large group shots worked better when everyone stood, that photographers preferred symmetry, that it was nothing personal. I reminded him I couldn't stand that holding myself upright without proper support wasn't an option, and that sudden positioning could trigger spasms or pain. He didn't respond to any of that. He said they would see how things went and asked me not to complicate the day before it even started. After the call ended, my mother immediately defended him, saying weddings brought out stress in people and that he didn't mean to exclude me. My father added that I needed to look at the bigger picture, that one day of discomfort for me was worth decades of peace for the family. I tried to explain that it wasn't about pictures or discomfort, that it was about being asked to pretend my body worked differently than it did, but the conversation closed before it opened. Over the next few days, I seriously considered not going. I pictured the ceremony happening without me, thought about the relief of not having to measure my movements, my tone, my presence. I drafted messages declining the invitation, rewriting each one because they sounded either defensive or cruel, neither of which I wanted to be accused of. When I mentioned staying home, my parents grew distant, disappointment settling into their voices. My mother said people would misunderstand. My father said absence would be taken as resentment. Neither asked why going felt impossible. The unspoken terms became clearer with every interaction. If I attended, I needed to be agreeable. If I didn't, I would become the problem. On the morning I finally said yes, it wasn't because I felt welcome or respected. It was because refusing meant standing alone against an entire history I was tired of arguing with. I told myself it was just one day, that I could manage my body and my expectations for a few hours, that staying quiet was still easier than being blamed. I accepted conditions that were never phrased as demands, knowing exactly what they cost me, and convinced myself that showing up even as an afterthought was still better than being remembered as the sister who caused trouble by not coming at all. The reception unfolded with the kind of polished efficiency that made everything feel predetermined, and I moved through it carefully aware that every interaction carried weight. I waited for a moment when Tyler wasn't surrounded and handed over the wedding gift, something practical and thoughtful chosen to blend in rather than stand out. He accepted it quickly, thanked me without meeting my eyes, and turned away mid-sentence to greet someone else, leaving the exchange unfinished. From where I sat afterward, I watched him work the room, laughing, touching shoulders, guiding conversations like a conductor. It took time to register that when my name came up, the tone shifted. Smiles softened into sympathy. Voices dipped comments framed as concern rather than celebration. I caught pieces as relatives passed close enough to think I couldn't hear remarks about how hard things had been for me, how fragile I seemed now, how Tyler had taken on so much responsibility despite everything. None of it was overtly cruel, and that was what made it effective. By the time people looked at me directly, their expressions were already shaped by a version of me I hadn't offered. Conversation slowed when I approached questions tipped with assumptions, suggestions that maybe I should sit somewhere quieter or take a break. I responded evenly, knowing that pushing back would only confirm whatever story had been planted. Across the room, Tyler observed it all with quiet approval, the narrative established before I ever had a chance to speak for myself. When it was time for family photos, the energy sharpened. Chairs were moved, guests repositioned, the photographer calling out instructions to create a clean line. Siblings and parents were asked to step forward. Tyler came to me again, closer this time, his voice low and urgent, saying it would help if I stood just briefly so the shot wouldn't look uneven. I told him calmly I didn't have the balance, that it wasn't a matter of trying, that my body didn't work that way. He frowned like I'd refused an easy request and said I was capable of effort, that this was about cooperation. I explained again that prolonged, unsupported sitting and sudden standing attempts could cause injury, that positioning wasn't negotiable. He glanced toward the photographer, then back at me, irritation leaking through his composure, and said, "Everyone was waiting." I felt eyes settle on us, curiosity sharpening into attention. He suggested I step out of frame instead, just temporarily until the main shots were done. His hand hovering near my chair as if guiding me away was the obvious solution. The meaning was clear, even if the words weren't. Heather approached before I could answer, her expression uneasy, asking if something was wrong. Tyler dismissed it quickly, saying there was no issue, only timing, and she didn't look convinced. She looked from him to me, noticing the tension, the way I hadn't moved, the way his posture blocked space, rather than shared it. The photographer called out again, louder this time, asking the family to finalize their positions. Tyler's voice tightened as he repeated himself, telling me to stand or move aside so they could get on with it. The room seemed to grow quieter around us guests, sensing interruption beneath the surface of celebration. I felt the familiar pressure rise, the expectation that I would accommodate, smooth things over, make myself smaller to preserve the moment. I stayed where I was, hands steady on my wheels, refusing without raising my voice, refusing by not complying. Heather didn't step back into line. She remained beside us, uncertainty written across her face, as if realizing too late that this wasn't about photos or logistics at all. Around us, conversation stalled, the flow of the reception, suspended attention narrowing toward a confrontation no one wanted to acknowledge, the air tight with judgment and anticipation, waiting to see which version of the story would be allowed to exist next. The moment control slipped away, it did not happen quietly. Tyler straightened, turned toward the nearest cluster of guests, and spoke loudly enough to draw the entire room into the moment, saying this had gone far enough, and that people deserved to know the truth, that I had been exaggerating my condition for attention since the accident, that I enjoyed being the center of concern. His words cut through the reception, giving others permission to stare openly, some shifting uncomfortably, others leaning in as if witnessing something overdue. I tried to answer, but he didn't pause. He repeated the accusation louder now, insisting that if I could sit through dinner and conversations, I could stand for one photo, claiming it was proof I was being dramatic rather than disabled. Before I could brace myself, his hand clamped onto my arm and the handle of my chair, impatient and forceful, and he pulled hard, as if correcting a stubborn object rather than touching a person. Balance abandoned me instantly. My feet didn't ground, my core failed, and I fell forward into the champagne tower positioned behind us, the structure collapsing under my weight with a violent crash, glass shattering outward, champagne flooding the floor in a cold spill that sent guests scrambling back. Pain shot through my spine and shoulders as I hit air knocked from my lungs, disorientation setting in before fear could even register. Tyler staggered back, staring at the wreckage with disbelief, before shouting that I had ruined everything, that this was exactly the kind of chaos he'd warned everyone about. The room erupted into noise until a calm, commanding voice cut through it. Dr. Leonard Hayes pushed forward decisively, knelt beside me, and told everyone to stop moving and clear the area. He placed his hands precisely, instructed me not to move my neck or hips, and looked up at Tyler, telling him firmly to step back now. The authority in his tone changed the atmosphere immediately. Guests froze mid-step. Servers backed away. Tyler hesitated, then retreated, his protests dying off as he realized no one was listening anymore. Heather was already on her phone, voice tight but steady, as she gave the address, explaining there had been an assault followed by a fall and that emergency services were needed immediately. Dr. Hayes continued calmly, asking me simple questions, monitoring my breathing, treating the scene like what it was, rather than what it had been pretending to be moments earlier. As the crowd settled into shocked silence, a man near the edge spoke up, saying he had recorded everything. Eric Boyd stepped forward with his phone still raised, explaining he'd started filming when Tyler began shouting and hadn't stopped until after the fall. The effect was immediate. Tyler's posture shifted, confidence draining from his face as he realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding that could be managed away. Sirens grew audible outside, growing louder by the second, and guests instinctively parted as uniformed officers entered, scanning the scene and asking who was injured. Dr. Hayes gave a concise account, factual and clinical, describing the mechanism of the fall and the need for evaluation, while Heather directed the officers to Eric and the video. Tyler attempted to explain himself, but one officer asked him to step back. Another knelt near me, asking questions about what had happened. For the first time that night, authority did not belong to family hierarchy, reputation, or convenience. It belonged to process, evidence, and accountability. As paramedics prepared the stretcher and officers began taking statements, the unspoken rules that had controlled my silence for years dissolved completely, replaced by formal questions that did not care whose wedding this was or what story someone preferred to tell. What happened next was no longer something my family could manage behind closed doors, and everyone in that room understood it. The hospital stripped everything down to facts. After the scans were reviewed, the attending physician confirmed there was no new spinal damage, only bruising and strain from the fall, painful but not destabilizing, a narrow margin that meant I wouldn't lose more than I already had. Dr. Leonard Hayes stayed long enough to explain what the images showed and what they did not, reassuring me that my baseline remained unchanged, then mentioning that if law enforcement requested prior records, he was obligated and prepared to provide them. When the officers returned, the tone in the room shifted again, no longer casual or conciliatory. They asked careful questions about my original injury, about inconsistencies between early reports, and medical findings, about why responsibility had never been clearly assigned. Dr. Hayes handed over the documentation without hesitation, timelines, operative notes, and assessments that aligned with what witnesses and video now suggested. The implication hovered unspoken. My parents arrived shortly after, anxious and subdued, taking positions on either side of the bed, like they always had, immediately reframing the situation as a misunderstanding. My mother spoke about stress and escalation, my father about reputations and consequences, both insisting there was still time to soften things if I helped. They asked me to clarify what Tyler had meant, to emphasize intent over outcome, to correct the record just enough to lower the stakes. The phrasing was familiar, a return to the language of protection that had always come at my expense. Tyler was brought in briefly under supervision, visibly shaken but still convinced salvage was possible. He said he had reacted that emotions ran high, that families didn't let moments like this define them. He asked me to say I'd overstated things to frame it as mutual misunderstanding, just enough to help him move forward. Listening to him, I realized how practiced that assumption had always been, that I would cover the gap between his actions and their consequences. A woman introduced herself as Sandra Liu, a lawyer retained once the video had circulated beyond the room, calm and precise, explaining my options without urgency. She said the evidence already spoke clearly that altering statements could expose me to risk, and that I did not owe anyone leniency to preserve harmony. With her present, the pressure changed shape. When officers asked if I wanted to amend my statement, I said no. When they asked whether I wished to request consideration or reduce charges, I said I was not asking for that. My parents fell quiet, disappointment replacing argument, and Tyler searched my face for the usual opening. I told him plainly that this wasn't about revenge or forgiveness, that it was about telling the truth now instead of rearranging it later, and that I was finished absorbing damage so other people could feel comfortable. The words landed without drama, but they changed the temperature of the room completely. Dr. Hayes nodded once as if recognizing a prognosis he'd already made. Sandra Liu thanked me for being clear and told the officers she would follow up as needed. They documented my decisions and stepped out to continue their process. When the room settled, there was no sense of victory, only an unfamiliar calm. My body was stable, my account was on record, and the path forward belonged to systems that didn't negotiate with guilt or obligation. For the first time since the accident, my silence wasn't being requested, and my compliance wasn't being assumed. I lay back against the pillows and breathed, aware that the choice I had just made wouldn't reunite anyone or soften what came next, but it returned something more important than approval. It returned the right to decide what I would no longer carry for other people. Once the hospital doors closed behind me, the story stopped being emotional and became procedural, which was somehow more relieving than anything dramatic could have been. The investigation moved forward without urgency or cruelty, just steady accumulation of facts. Video footage from Eric Boyd, witness statements that never changed, medical assessments from Dr. Hayes that aligned too cleanly to dispute. Tyler's defense tried to frame the incident as chaos, poor judgment, heightened stress. But the court saw something simpler, a deliberate use of force against someone who physically could not protect herself. The conviction carried real prison time, not symbolic punishment, not a lesson about anger management dressed up as justice. When sentencing was announced, Tyler didn't look defiant or broken. He looked confused, as if accountability had arrived without asking his permission, and for the first time that confusion wasn't my responsibility to resolve. Heather ended the engagement before the verdict became public. No speech, no narrative control, just a short request to talk. When we met, she didn't defend her past silence or ask me to absolve her. She said she should have questioned the version of events she was given, and admitted she didn't, because it was easier not to, and that acknowledgement mattered more than apology ever could. I wished her well because resentment felt unnecessary, not because forgiveness was required. My parents responded the way they always had, not by denying what happened, but by reframing it, suggesting I could have influenced the outcome differently if I had considered the family as a whole. They spoke about unity, about moving past things, about how consequences shouldn't define a lifetime, and I realized they still meant my lifetime, not Tyler's. I didn't argue with them anymore. A few weeks later, I moved out quietly, closed leases, forwarded mail, and relocated to a place where my history wasn't shorthand for tension. Paige Carter helped me find an apartment that didn't treat accessibility as an inconvenience, and more importantly, she treated me like a complete adult without needing a hierarchy of gratitude. We met through a rehabilitation support network, not instant friends, just two people who exchanged practical suggestions before trust, which made the trust solid when it came. She became my family, not by promising protection, but by respecting my autonomy, by never telling me what I should soften or who I should tolerate for peace. Messages from my parents arrived in waves, at first reflective one week, accusatory the next, always circling back to obligation. I blocked them without announcement, without explanation, because clarity had already been provided and repeating myself felt like self-negotiation. That decision wasn't dramatic. It was calm, almost administrative, and that calm told me it was right. Life afterward didn't look triumphant or inspirational, it looked stable. My days became predictable in the best way, work therapy routines that didn't revolve around defending my reality. I stopped bracing for conversations that might turn into negotiations about my validity. People often confuse closure with reconciliation, but closure doesn't require consensus. It only requires honesty with yourself. I didn't rebuild relationships to prove resilience, and I didn't cling to anger to justify distance. I understood that boundaries don't need to be loud to be permanent, and that walking away without hatred is still walking away. What happened at that wedding didn't define the rest of my life, but it clarified it. I learned that self-respect sometimes looks like saying nothing further, that protection isn't always about standing closer, and that choosing yourself doesn't make you disloyal, it makes you done carrying weight that was never yours. The life I stepped into after all of it wasn't built in opposition to my family, it was built in relief from them, and that difference changed everything. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.